Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I am joined by Philip Fracassi. He's an acclaimed horror author, he's a screenwriter, he's a Bram Stoker Award finalist. He is known for his mastery of atmospheric dread and psychological terror. And today he is here to talk to me about this book, Boys in the Valley. So welcome to the show, Philip.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate it.
So, first of all, I always like to start these things off by just getting to know you a little bit. So, I'll ask the obligatory easy question right up front. Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I mean, I've I've been a writer my whole life, but I've only been a published author. Let's see, since about 2015, so fairly new in the big picture of things. But yeah, I've had a lot of different lives. I've worked in the film industry on and off for 20 years. I owned a used and rare bookstore in Venice Beach for 7 years. I was in the music industry for 7 years, and I just really I only had enough success on the writing publishing front that I was able to become a full-time writer a couple years back. So that's my day job now. I'm also a screenwriter, so I've written screenplays that have been produced by Disney and Lifetime. And but yeah, so now my full-time job is writing fiction and the occasional screenplay, and it's been a lot of fun.
Oh, amazing. So, for horror, I'd love to know what your journey was to horror. How did you arrive in horror? That's always my favorite conversation.
Yeah, well, I think it's twofold. I think how I arrived at horror as a reader and a fan, was really just I think like many of us, especially my age, but even younger readers, I discovered horror through Stephen King was the gateway drug. I mean, honestly, for me, I think my first horror book was actually Dean Koontz. I think it was Watchers by Dean Koontz, and I read that, and then I read Strangers, and so I got really into Dean Koontz, and then I gatewayed into Stephen King and read The Shining and The Talisman and all that stuff, and I was hooked, and I got and then you kind of expand from there, right? Then you get into Barker and Straub and as you all that great stuff. So it was a lot of fun. I was a big, even as a young kid, I was reading a lot of fantasy and science fiction, but horror really caught me up. And so yeah, so I've always been a horror reader. I'm not a big, I'm not one of those guys, although I've seen probably every horror movie there is. I'm not really someone who's like super into like the Jason slasher movies and stuff like that. I've seen everything, but I'm really more on the reader side is where my fandom I would say comes in. And then as a horror writer, it's interesting because like I said, I've been a writer my whole life, but I was never published. But I probably wrote like 100 short stories. I wrote 3 novels, but none of it was genre. None of it was horror. It was all just kind of character based fiction. And then, but I would start writing horror. But then when I was in my like 40s, I started writing like horror screenplays, and I started the Lifetime movie was like a ghost story, and the Disney movie was not a horror movie. That was a kid movie. But I started writing a lot of horror screenplays. So I started developing that. I started developing stories for that, and I was taking meetings with Blumhouse, and I was taking meetings with CBS, and I was having some traction there. And then the screenplay thing, I want to say it fizzled out, but I got kind of disenchanted with it. I was doing a lot of work and I wasn't being paid for it. And when I say work, I don't mean like necessarily writing a spec screenplay. I mean like I was would have a screenplay and there would be a studio or a producer attached or a director attached, and I'd be doing rewrites and rewrites and rewrites
Mm.
for 6 months to a year and never make a dime, and then the thing would just go away. And I was like, this is dumb, a very dumb use of my time. So, um, so yeah, and then I was like one day it kind of hit me like a lightning bolt, and I was talking to my wife on the phone, I remember, and I was talking about how frustrated I was with horror screenplays, and then I was like, well, wait a minute, why don't I just try writing horror fiction? And I've never tried that before. I've only written, so why don't I can kind of combine these two worlds? And my first story I ever wrote, this is in probably 2014. I wrote a story called Mother, and I sent it to Laird Barron, who's one of the generational great horror writers, and he and I had become friends because I was trying to adapt one of his stories into a screenplay. So I said, "Hey, what do you think? Do you think I have like, do you think I should keep my day job or what?" And he was very complimentary and very enthusiastic and had some great feedback and notes. And he kind of basically became my mentor for the next like decade. And we're still very good friends. But he was really helping me become kind of helped me become a writer and helped me become a professional writer, and it really helped me understand fiction and horror fiction. And he was just an invaluable friend during that time. And yeah, and I wrote, and Mother was I sent Mother to one publisher, and within, I think it was like 3 hours, they emailed me back and said we'd love to publish it. And that was Dunham's Manor Press, Jordan Kroll at Dunham's Manor Press. And then a few months after that, I wrote Alter, and I sent that to Jordan, and he said, "Yeah, I'd love to publish that." And so that those two chapbooks were my first publications. And then I got an email from Journal Stone, and they said, "Hey, do you have enough for a collection?" And I said, "I can, give me a minute," and put out Behold the Void, and a year later in 2017. So it just kind of from that moment on, I would say from the time Alter was published, really, but really when Mother was published, but Alter really took off, and that's the story that's going to be A24 just made into a feature film that's coming out later this year. So things really just kind of took off from there. I mean, obviously there's dips and there's mountains and valleys in this business and in publishing, and you have to kind of like keep that even keel. But for the most part, despite this is like a stock market chart, right? Despite the ups
Yep.
and downs, it was consistently going up, and I was fine. I was placing my stories, and not to over answer, but then and then I was able to get an agent, and the agent was like, "Okay, if you want to have a career in writing, you need to start writing novels." And so I wrote A Child Alone with Strangers in 2018. And then, yeah, and then things have just been nonstop since then. And then a couple years later, I was able to start writing full time. And now I'm very fortunate and blessed that I've had enough people wanting to publish my work that I'm pretty much writing, I'm kind of behind the 8 ball, as it were, just trying to keep up with stuff that I've committed to. So it's been a really great ride, and I'm so ecstatic about the horror community's acceptance of my work. It's been really humbling and a real blessing.
Well, that is absolutely fantastic. I love this journey. I love hearing about it because you don't always hear that kind of journey, and I think it's fantastic. And I love that you're. And actually, I want to get into the book, but it actually has formed another question for me. If you started out writing screenplays, how are you about your process for writing? Are you very big on like outlining and formatting and all of that stuff, or you just dive in? I found working my when I first started writing, it was for screenplays as well. I very much sort of tend to I love it organized. I love it formatted. I'd love to know sort of what's going to happen. It doesn't
Yeah.
change where it's going to go, but I love that it's just kind of organized.
Yeah, I think folks like us who have that screenwriting background, I think once you're trained in writing story in that way, in a 3 act structure or in a 12 beat structure or 22 beat structure, however you've learned to do it, I think it's hard not to have that framework in your brain when you're writing a longer piece of fiction. So to answer your question, yeah, I'm the same way. When I'm writing short stories, I'm very much about what's the core idea and how does it end, and that's pretty much the two things that I know ahead of time. And then I usually do is I actually have an example right here because I'm working on a short story right now. Like I just print like a sheet of like all capitals. Here's what happens. Blah 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 blah. and I just kind of get it all out to get the basic story, like the skeleton out, and then I just write it. So short stories is not as much structure. Novellas, I would say a little more structure in that it's similar to short story. I'll write everything out as to how it happens, and then I'll go back and I'll start writing it from the beginning. But with novels, to your point, I'm an intensive outliner. I use Scrivener for that, and I usually have every single before I start writing the book. I usually have every single chapter outlined, what happens in that chapter, who are all the characters, what are the primary beats of the story, and all that stuff before I start writing the novel. But it's been interesting because I've written, I think, I wrote three novels before I became a horror writer, and two of those have actually since been republished. Those I those I wrote without the outline structure stuff because I really hadn't been a trained screenwriter at that point, so I really didn't know what I was doing. And then having done all the research and learned about screenwriting and all that kind of stuff, which I did for many years. Then when I approached the next novel, my first genre novel, which is a 600 page chunker of a book, and it's there. I treated it like I would have a screenplay, and that I outlined everything. And what's been interesting though is like so I've written I think six novels I think since I started writing horror full time, and my last my latest novel, which is called The Autumn Springs Retirement Home Massacre, that's coming out from Tor Nightfire on September 30th. That was the first book I ever of the six, we'll call it, that I wrote without an outline. And it wasn't by choice. It was that for some reason when I sat down to like, okay, I'm gonna start knocking out the beats of this story, I couldn't I just nothing was coming to me. I couldn't see the story that way. And it's the first time that's happened to me because I wrote like Gothic and Boys in the Valley and A Child Alone with Strangers. All those were heavily outlined and before I started writing. And so it was interesting writing Autumn Springs that way. And I know a lot of writers who do very well don't outline. Ron Malfi, Chuck Wendig, I've had these conversations with them. But it was interesting. I wouldn't say I liked the experience because it was very nerve-wracking and anxiety inducing, not knowing, to your
Yep.
point, what's going to happen next or how is it going to end. But at the same time, it was really interesting and it was a fascinating experience. So I'm not sure if like my brain is like I don't know if I'm getting like to the point where I maybe don't rely so heavily on an outline to write a book, but I much prefer an outline, especially given the experience I just went through, because I like to know what's going to happen next. I don't want to sit when I sit down to write a new chapter. I don't want to be thinking about what happens later in this book. I want to know exactly what happens later in this book so that I can just focus on that chapter. I can focus on the characters. I can focus on the dialogue. I can focus on the prose, and I'm not thinking about the overall arc of the whole story. I'm just very focused on what I'm being in the moment of the story is very important to me. So and also with mysteries and thrillers and stuff like that, because like Autumn Springs is sort of a whodunit, and I wrote another novel called The Blue Butterfly that's sort of a whodunit that hopefully will come out in the next couple of years. You want to know you want to know who the killer is. You want to know what the plot points are. You want to know what the twists are, so that you can sort of set the reader up a little bit as you're going. Obviously, you want to drip in red herrings. You want to have like different suspects and so I think it's hard to go back and do that. I think I'd prefer to do that on the first pass through. So for all those reasons, I prefer outlining. That said, I've done it both ways, and while I appreciated doing it without an outline, I appreciated the like, oh, this is interesting. What's going to happen next? The professional in me was having like a nervous breakdown because I really didn't want to have to be thinking about that while I was actually writing the book. But a lot of writers, like I said, they'll start writing and the other thing that happens is I don't like to do a lot of writing for free, as it were. So point being is like if a lot of times a writer will write themselves into a corner because they don't know where they're going, and then they have to kind of scrap the last you know
Yep.
10,000 words or whatever because it doesn't work. So that's not something that I'm interested in. I don't like that. My time is too precious to me, and so that's another reason why I feel like outlining for me anyway is probably the way to go.
For me, sometimes too, it also helps to keep me on track or focused in that, my mind can jump around a bit. And
Yeah.
if I'm not in the mood to tell this person's story in this moment, maybe I can go over here and do this before I come back to that. So it does help me sort of stay on track a little
Yeah,
bit.
and to your point, Rick, like, for people who are listening who are writers, and I remember when I had some early conversations when I was first kind of coming into the horror field of being a writer, and I was kind of surprised at how many writers were like kind of like looking down their nose at me a little bit because I was a screenwriter, and they were like, "Oh, I don't write with a formula. I don't use a template. I just write. I'm just like an artist or whatever." And I'm like, "That's that's not really how it works." Like it's like not it's like I don't need to know grammar. I'm an artist. It's like no, these are all tools
Yep.
that will help you
Eventually
become a
you
better.
will. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
Eventually you will need that tool that
Yeah.
you say
It's
you
like
don't
you
use.
have to know the rules before you can break them. It's like that kind of rule. And the other thing is, and it helps you create a better story. If you have an understanding of basic beat structure for a story, that's incredibly helpful when you're writing a novel length piece because you have an idea of like when you have to put certain elements in or how a story kind of works for a reader. And the other thing is, which I tell people all the time, is just because you outline something and you said this, it doesn't mean your story doesn't mean you can't change the story. It doesn't mean you may I wrote like I mentioned the blue butterfly. I was writing that story, and that story was intensively outlined because it's multiple time, takes multiple, different time periods. It's kind of a who done it. There's all these like characters, and I definitely wanted to have it all figured out before I started writing it. But I was like maybe three quarters the way through the book, and my main character in the scene I was writing did something that was absolutely 100% the opposite of what I had in my outline. And I was just kind of going with it because I was like, "Oh, this is interesting. I want to see where this goes." And it ended up changing the whole last like fourth of the quarter of the book. And I had to go back and re-outline the last quarter because of what happened in this one scene. And I was happy to do it because it felt right in the moment. And I ended up so it's not like it's not like you're constricted by it, but it does give you a framework
Yeah.
to work from. And to your point, it keeps you accountable. It's like, oh, it's also nice to know, like, okay, this is where I am in the story, and now I've got, you have like an idea of how much story you have left, how you're going to pace it. It helps with pacing. It helps for me. It helps with pretty much everything, every element of the story.
I think you and I are very much the same in that regard. So, all right, we got to talk about this book. I This is such a great book. I really enjoyed this book, Boys in the Valley, because it touches on one of my favorite sort of themes, I guess, in the genre. And so I'm going to start with you first. I'm going to have you just tell us a little bit about what the book is about, and then we'll dive in.
Right. So, Boys in the Valley it's about a children's orphanage set in rural Pennsylvania in the year 1905 is when the story takes place. And so it's about these boys who are very isolated. There's 30 boys. They're all between the ages of like 6 and 16. And there are five priests, Catholic priests, who run this orphanage that's sponsored by the church. And, but they, they're completely cut off. The nearest, they have to go by horse and buggy 2 hours to get to a farm where they buy all their food supplies that they don't raise. Otherwise, everything's raised and grown on site, and the boys are basically slave labor at, for themselves. And then one night, there's a knock at the orphanage door, and it's the sheriff from the town 3 hours away, and he's riding back with a prisoner, and the prisoner is dying, and he knows that the one of the priests, the head priest, was a surgeon during the Civil War, so he says, "Can you keep him alive long enough for us to get him back and basically hang him?" And so when they bring this man in, he's covered in these like this is not spoiler. I don't. Well, it's a little spoiler. It's not spoiler, but it's a plot point. But they bring him in. He's kind of covered in these like archaic symbols, and he's carved into himself, and then it's revealed through dialogue that what this guy was actually doing and why they actually arrested him, and it's pretty awful stuff. And because the guy is in the orphanage and because they can't save him, the evil that is inside of him is released, into the orphanage. And some of the kids who live there are infected by this evil, and some of the kids are not. And cue the giant snowstorm that comes in, and so they're all kind of trapped in this hot box of horror for the remainder of the book, and it's sort of a Lord of the Flies meets The Exorcist is the marketing tagline for it, which I think is actually pretty apt. So that's the that's the baseline uh, plot of the book.
I love it. I mean, it's the perfect storm from hell, right? Literally.
Yeah, yeah, right,
Love it.
right. That
I
should have
want
been the tagline.
to there you go. I want to talk about the setting a little bit. So, as you mentioned, it takes place in the early 1900s in Pennsylvania in an orphanage. What drew you to this specific setting? And talk, I mean, I think you've already set it up a little bit, but I'd love to know it's in the given the time frame and the location and how remote it is all like it is the perfect storm of when that snowstorm comes in. You know, these kids are just screwed, you know. So
Right.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what drew you to that setting.
Yeah. So when I mentioned earlier that I was writing screenplays and I was kind of coming up with different ideas for screenplay or ideas, I was researching an idea about a haunted orphanage, and I came across a story that is a real true story, and it was about an orphanage in rural Pennsylvania in the early 1900s. And what happened in the real life was that half of the kids mysteriously vanished from the orphanage. So during like a wellness check, what have you, they realized that half of the children um, were gone, and it was kind of a bit of an unsolved mystery slash the church sort of swept it under the rug sort of thing. The orphanage was closed down. The kids were sent to factories or other orphanages. Um, and that was sort of the end of the story. And I think that was what I based my story on was that real life story of these kids. And I was like, well, I'm very, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, well, what do I think could have happened in that orphanage? So that was the impetus for the setting and the time frame and all that stuff. That kind of got my wheels turning. And then everything else was just, was fiction. But that's why the orphanage ended up in Pennsylvania, say, versus like Wyoming or what have you. Plus, you have to remember it's 1900, so the East Coast is sort of where a lot of that stuff was happening. And but yeah, but that was but that's why I chose that area, and that's why I chose that time period.
I love it. I mean, it was right off the bat. I was like, oh, already I could. I was like, I already feel the tension from it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the characters, especially your main character, Peter. He's definitely been through some things. He's struggling with some internal and then ultimately external struggles. What talk a little bit about his character? What drew you to his character? What is his? How did you approach developing his arc? I'm curious. Is he
Right.
inspired by anybody you know?
Peter, no. I think with Peter was my thinking with Peter was I knew he was going to be my primary protagonist. And the thing that's tricky about this book or about writing this book is that there are multiple key protagonists. And the antagonists are, some of the antagonists are sort of like it's a gray area, meaning you don't really the one thing that's interesting about this book is that you don't really know for sure what one character is going to do from one scene to the next because they're all pretty much real people in the sense that they have decision making and it's not always they don't always do what you would expect them to do. With Peter, I wanted very much to have a character who the reader was going to, who's going to take the reader's hand and guide them through this story. And that's one of the reasons I kind of fiddled with with POV and which is that Peter Peter's chapters are told in first person. The other characters' chapters are told in third person. And one of the reasons I did that, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons I did that was because I really wanted the reader to be like, okay, now we're back into like hand holding mode. Now we're back into like Now we're back, being guided to the story, and it's a different feeling than when you're reading those two things. So when you're reading about Peter, I wanted the reader to really feel like they were identifying, they were seeing the world through Peter's eyes. And but his character, I you know, it was important to me that he'd be incredibly compassionate, but also be a boy and have the same challenges, the same confusions that any child. He's a young man. I think he's 15 in the book, and when he's given he's being groomed, for example, to become a priest and take over, become a priest at the orphanage, and he goes through some things in the story that challenge that, and his past, which is pretty dark, also challenges that, what he believes and what he doesn't believe, and what his struggle of faith was sort of a big element for him. So a lot of times when I'm thinking of characters, I'm thinking about what is their inner conflict. And for Peter, the inner conflict was faith and sacrifice. And what's interesting about Peter's story specifically is, and I don't read a lot of reviews, but I've read some of the reviews for the book that were public, and it was interesting to me that some reviewers had walked away with the sense that Peter was Peter's was divinely guided to do the things that he did in the story, and I was a little frustrated by that, because I would thought that I'd made it pretty clear in writing it, that it was very much Peter was making his own decisions for himself, and had nothing really to do with divine intervention per se. And that was important to me too when I was writing it. So, but those choices that he has to make in the story are pretty impossible choices, right? They're for anybody, especially for a young man or woman. So I think so that's what made him so fascinating to me. And I didn't want his conflict to be external. I really wanted it to be wholly internal, and so that when he made the decisions that he made, he was doing it for the right reasons, and it was a choice that he was making versus just something that he was forced to
He
do
arrived
by,
there on his own, basically.
yeah,
So
or by an
that's very much
external
how it
force.
felt for me.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, you said you touched on something that I was going to bring up a little later, but I love how you wrote this with the different POVs.
Mm,
I thought it was really great. I love that Peter is all first person, everyone else was third person. It did make it very easy. I've read quite a few books, and sometimes it's always not as clean, but you made it very easy for me to say, it's not a new chapter, you're doing it in the same chapter, but I always knew where we were with the story.
mhm.
So I love that. I thought it was really, really great. So
Thank you.
well done for me. Loved it. So
Yeah, it's a bit of a magic trick. I mean, in some ways, to make sure it's done the right way, and it's the point. Yeah, you definitely don't want it to be confusing, and and I think there's four other characters that have chapters that have POVs. So, from remembering correctly, but yeah, sometimes it's fun to do that kind of thing too. I'm a big fan of utilizing the mechanics of writing to kind of create a different experience for the writer. And I think, for example, in my novel, A Child Alone with Strangers, I think the first 100 to 150 pages of that book are told in the past tense, and the remaining 400 plus pages of the book are told in present tense. And the reason I did that is because there comes a point in the book where there's a big plot point moment, and an impactful moment, and I wanted the reader to basically have this experience of like reading, oh my god, right, reading, and then like all of a sudden, like we're gonna go about 20 miles per hour faster the rest of the way, and I'm gonna push down on the gas now. And I think that was something. So that I played with that, because I was like, okay, we're speeding things up, and from this point forward, we're going to start moving a lot faster. And so things like that I like doing, and it's something for me. It's interesting as a writer to play with the mechanics of storytelling, in fiction specifically.
I think it was Sam Ripley did something very similar with the Rule of Three, and sort of how he was telling that story and moving back and forth between different characters with different points of view on things. And I really liked his technique too. So he was playing with both
Yeah,
weapons.
as long as it serves the story, and would never want it to be a distraction, but if it serves the story, then sometimes those can be neat things to play with, yeah.
So, so the subject matter, demonic possession, has is one I think that fascinates a lot of people. Certainly, and as I mentioned, it's one of my favorite of the genre. And I was asking myself as I put together this question, I was like, well, what is the answer for me? And I don't know if I know, but my question is, what do you think makes demonic possession such a compelling narrative for people? I mean, why are we so drawn to it, I guess, in your opinion? 'Cause
That's
I
a good
couldn't answer the
question.
question myself, I don't know. So
That's a good question. I think there's an element of being controlled by, having your physical body controlled by a demonic entity or any entity. I think if you look at something like, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's a similar fear, right, of something taking over control of your body and mind, and I think that's one element of it, and I think people kind of like, I think, from a reader or viewer consumer perspective, I think it's interesting to see like what's going to happen with this person with this when they're completely taken over by something else, and so I think that's one element of it. I think, we've always had a fascination with evil and, demons and hell and all that good stuff. I think has been so ingrained into society and into culture that I think that also is a fascination for people. And I think the combination of that, a combination of taking something like, for example, if you have a movie like Constantine or comic, whatever, like Constantine, where it's like, oh, he's fighting demons. That to me is less interesting because it's so farcical in a way. It's so unbelievable that might be entertaining, but it's not something that you're going to be emotionally connected with, probably. Whereas like a possession, it's taking all of that evil and all of that horror and putting it into a human body. Now all of a sudden we're connecting with it because now all of a sudden we're like, well, wait a minute, we're humans too, so that's weird. And so seeing how it affects a human body, I think is sort of like brings those two things together, it's like that loss of control and also the supreme evil. And I think it makes it relatable. And it's interesting is when I was writing Boys in the Valley, and I don't really correct people on this because I don't think it's that kind of a thing, but from my perspective as the writer, I never really thought of it as demon possession. I thought the boys, I always referred to it as the boys were infected by the evil and versus they were possessed by the evil. Because in my mind, all the boys are still making their own decisions. And I think I set that up a lot with how horrible the conditions are at this orphanage, the way boys are treated. And I think the boys that end up being we'll call it the antagonist of the story, in my mind, they're very aware of what they're doing and they're definitely making the decisions that they're making knowledgeably, but they are definitely infected with this like darkness that is sort of like pushing them to do things that they would normally never do. It's kind of like erasing the barriers between right and wrong. And it's also giving and with like a little sprinkle of like supernatural powers as well. The book overall, there's really not a lot of that stuff that you to get in a typical, you know, possession movie. There's not levitating and there's not all that, you know, crawling on the ceilings and stuff like that. They're still boys, and so I think that makes it a little more horrific in a way that they are still just kids, but they definitely have that infection going on, and that's also one of the things that makes I think David's character so fascinating, at least for me as a writer, because and Brother Johnson also because
Oh, we have to
they
talk about Johnson.
yeah, because we'll talk about it, but because those 2 characters, right, are constantly on that knife's edge of which way do I fall, and I thought that for me as a writer was really fascinating to explore.
As far as I was almost gonna say, infected is a great word. I was almost gonna say almost inspiration because I'm thinking about that scene, and I'm gonna be real careful and vague here because I don't want to. It's a kind of a spoiler, and it's near the end, so I don't want to give too much away. But I'm thinking about that scene with Brother Johnson and Bartholomew, and that is where you know, Bartholomew is. Well, I got to be careful. I may have to edit that out. He sort of explains what's happening, and it comes off to me as I'm opening the door, and you can choose to walk through it. Is sort of how it felt for me. But one of the things I absolutely loved is with the scene with Brother Johnson, where the again being careful, the noise, and everything that's happening there. I love that. So I really wanted to mention that. But
Yeah, and that was interesting. That was, and that, again, we'll stay away from spoilers, but that was, and this isn't a spoiler, I don't think at all. But I really wanted to give the reader a sense of what they were experiencing internally. And
did.
that was the kind of the point of writing that was like, I'm not just going to describe what they're doing. I really want to describe what's going on inside of these characters as well, so that there's a better understanding of why they're doing the things they're doing. And yeah, so thank you. That was an interesting
Well received. I just
thing to write. Yeah.
absolutely I wrote it down because I'm going to say without giving too much away, is there a particular moment or a scene that you're most excited for readers to experience? And that was definitely one of mine. The I love the way you, like I told you earlier, I love the way you wrote the POVs and did all of that. But that particular scene that we were just talking about was probably my all-time favorite out of all of it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there is a scene in the story that's close to my heart, which is one of the when I first thought of the idea, there were a couple scenes that kind of popped into my head, which is always a good sign when you're coming up when you're thinking about a new idea. If it starts growing exponentially in your mind, you know you've maybe got
Yep.
something. But there was one scene, and that was one of the earliest scenes I thought of, and that really scared me. And it's the and again, this won't be spoiler free, but it's the scene where one of the boys is punished, and he's taken to the punishment place where one of the other boys is also being taken. And one of and the one boy is very aware that the other boy has been infected with this evil, and he knows that he's being basically taken to being put in a very bad situation. And his terror at that moment was felt very real to me, and was a moment in the book that I knew I wanted to really try and do my best to really nail, because that was one of the scenes where I thought, this is a scene that's going to really, I hope, really scare some people. And so that's probably my favorite scene in the book.
Yes, that was a good one too. So reflecting on your journey with this book from its inception all the way to publication and now to the release of the paperback version, what has been the most rewarding aspect for you as an author?
Specifically as it pertains to Boys in the Valley.
Yes.
Well, it's a tough question. I think, when this was my first major release. So the two I think the two novels that had come out before were both with independent presses. Gothic was with Cemetery Dance. Child Alone with Strangers was with Skyhorse. And they're not, they're independent presses. So there's a limitation. My story collections were with independent presses. So Boys in the Valley was my first Big Five release, and so that was really fulfilling. I think, to feel like I kind of cracked a little bit that ceiling, and it made me feel, as a professional writer, it just was very, I don't want to say vindicating, but it was very fulfilling, and it made me feel like, okay, I can kind of like play in the same realm as the big boys, and all these other the big writers who are um and so that was exciting, because for me, it's about the readership. And if when you one of the nice things about working with a Macmillan or a Hachette, I've worked with both now, is that so many more people read your books, frankly. and they just get the book out so much wider. And then there's like a UK publisher and there's Spanish publisher and all this stuff. So that was really fulfilling because I felt like more people were reading my work. And so that was probably the most fulfilling part. And then I would say almost secondary and second, almost tied with that was being able to go on the road. I spent, I think, 2 months on the road. I self-funded a tour, cross-country tour for Boys in the Valley, and where I raised money through a Kickstarter. And my wife and I like traveled, across the country and hit like 30 bookstores from the East Coast to the West Coast. And so that was really fulfilling because I got to meet a lot of booksellers. I got to meet a ton of readers, got to sign a lot of books, shake a lot of hands, take a lot of pictures, all that kind of stuff. So that was really fun for me. It was the first time I'd really experienced that. So I think that those were the two things that personally came out of the publication of Boys in the Valley that was pretty neat and pretty fulfilling.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. I love the touring, as I would think would probably be a lot of fun. So
It can be the thing with touring that I think nowadays that I think a lot of writers I maybe don't fully understand because I haven't been there yet, and I didn't understand it before. But at this point, with social media and the proliferation of social media and all that kind of stuff, I think there's a lot less books. Publishers are a lot less about touring authors, and it's more about, as an author, do you want to like spend your own dime to go out and tour for a book? So it is fun, but it's also it can be costly, and it's certainly a lost leader in that you're not, you're probably it's more of a long-term play. You're hoping to build up readership and for future titles and that kind of thing, and let people know who you are. But it is cool. So, like, for example, I have a book coming out in March called The Third Rule of Time Travel, which is a science fiction thriller from Orbit. And I think I'm going to go to like three, three stores for that one, and keep it pretty local. But then in September, October, when my next Nightfire horror novel comes out, I'll probably do a bigger tour for that because I have more of a horror readership, so it'll make more sense. But yeah, it is fun. It's just a little, you have to kind of like be strategic about it, and just know that like you're probably going to go out of pocket on the expenses. So you have to kind of be strategic about what you do and where you go.
it's fantastic. Well, the book is Boys in the Valley. It's available everywhere now, and the paperback version is out as of February 11th, and the hardcover came out, I want to say 2023. Is that right?
July 2023. Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So, as we always like to say here at Quills and Chills, please go and support your local bookstores whenever possible. And Philip, can you tell our audience how we can find you online or on social?
Yes. So my website is pfracassi.com. That's the best place to find me or to contact me. And then I'm also on Facebook. I just search Philip Fracassi. I'm also on Bluesky and Instagram at pfracassi. So those are the best places to find me.
Sweet. And as usual, I will have those in the show notes and up on screen for the YouTube version. So, Philip, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. I could talk to you all day long, but I know I probably got to let you go for the weekend. So,
All right. Thank you, Rick. Appreciate it.
all right, you got it. All right, you guys, thank you, and we'll see you next time on Quills and Chills. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.